It's usual at the start of a talk like this to say it's great to be here, but it's emotional in this case. And it's emotional because the reason I'm here is because of Dexter Johnson, whom you can see here. Now, I'm going to be mentioning the Blackfoot and other First Peoples at the end of the talk in a way that will be a little unusual for you. You haven't seen anything quite like what you're going to see at the end of the talk. I'm going to be linking Dexter to them. Dexter's father, Dan, is here, just over here in the front row on the edge here, and he's the reason that I'm here, in that he got in touch with me and a group of other people trying to work out what had happened to his son, Dexter, who had, unbeknownst to Dan, gone on fluoxetine, which is Prozac, in a low dose, felt worse, the dose was put up. He felt even worse, the dose was put up further. He felt even worse and talked about thinking about killing himself, and the dose was put up further, and Dexter is no longer with us as of a little over a year ago. Having seen his medical records and having seen other materials linked to the case, it's my view that all of you probably, if you had the chance to see what I've seen, would probably come to the view that Prozac killed Dexter. Now, as for the title of the talk, it comes from the Troy story and the Trojan horse. In this case, the key word, as you'll see later on in the talk, it'll become clear why it's the key word, is the word gifts. Well, that story begins is here with this slide, which is from the New York Times at the end of August last. There were hundreds of comments after it, and everybody agreed, yes, we've got a bad state of affairs in the United States, and likely up here as well, or else we'll have it soon, which is a lot of teens are on different psychotropic drugs, up to 10 at a time. Everybody agreed this isn't a good idea, particularly because the teens involved didn't seem to be getting well. And it was bipartisan. The Republican New York Post and the Democrat New York Times were all saying the same thing. But none of these articles were pinpointing just what's going wrong. Why are our kids ending up on all these drugs? This talk will hopefully shed a bit of light on that. The story that led to Dexter's death began 33 years ago, and it also led to our teens being on all these drugs. Began 33 years ago when 3 clinicians from Harvard reported on 6 cases, men and women, who they thought had become suicidal taking Prozac. In terms of the usual ways we go about looking at cause and effect, this article nailed it. There was really little doubt that they had shown quite clearly that some people could become suicidal on this drug. Others might do awfully well, but some could become suicidal. They didn't tell you about the people who had died, one of whom included a 14-year-old boy. This article was just about the people who became suicidal, got off the drug, it cleared up, and they came back, and this helped prove the point that the drug had caused the problem. Harvard and Yale don't usually agree on things, but in this case, it was an article from Yale a short while afterwards showing the same thing was happening to children. Again, they reported on 6 cases, but in this case, it was 6 out of 42 children, so 1 in 7 children were becoming suicidal. There are about 10 or 20 articles from different places in the United States and around the world reporting the same kind of thing. One article of which came from me, reporting on 2 men who had become suicidal taking Prozac. The problem cleared up when the drug was halted. The problem came back when they were put on a related SSRI drug. Prozac is one of the SSRI group of antidepressants. Given the men involved, there was very little way to account for what had happened other than saying that Prozac had caused the problem. I've put the word evidence-based medicine here, which is probably a word you haven't ever heard before. You've heard evidence-based medicine. Almost a week that my article came out, there was an article in the British Medical Journal from Eli Lilly, who make Prozac, saying there are cases around the place being reported of people becoming suicidal on this drug. Well, we've analyzed our randomized controlled clinical trial database, our RCT database, and there's no evidence from this that Prozac makes people become suicidal. So these cases you're hearing about are sad but anecdotal, and the plural of anecdote is not data, as everyone knows. They said it's the disease, depression makes people suicidal, which we all agree, not our drug. They said RCTs are the scientific way to prove cause and effect on a drug. And the challenge to the public, you, doctors like me, the media, the politicians, was, are you going to believe the science or the anecdotes? This was the first article of what we now call the evidence-based medicine era. And the people who make guidelines, the people who regulate drugs, the politicians, Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden, and the Pope, every authority around the place wants you to believe Lilly's story and do not want you to believe the story you've heard before, the evidence-based medicine story. I'm not going to go into the details of how Lilly cooked the books. I'm just simply going to tell you, when you get access to the raw data behind their trials, it's very clear that those trials showed that people become suicidal on Prozac. So the evidence-based medicine that I've put to you is clear evidence that this drug can cause a problem, is consistent with the randomized controlled trials. So I'm asking you, in this case, to believe your own experience over randomized controlled trials to some extent, but not saying that randomized controlled trials are useless. Lilly are saying to you that their randomized controlled trials show you what a drug does, and if your experience is different, that it's causing you a problem, you are wrong. And your doctor, who believes Lilly these days, is not going to believe you. So this causes problems. This goes to the heart of what is science. It doesn't just go to the heart of what is science. If there's two completely different views of science, and one is right and the other is wrong, practicing in the wrong way is not right. It's immoral. Now, we've got the Pope and Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden and the regulators and the guideline makers on one side, and you've got one or two people like me and Dan on the other side. We're not going to take a vote at the end and ask you, who do you believe? But I'm hoping you're going to be disturbed and say, well, it's unlikely that two dudes are right and all the rest of the world is wrong. But I hope it's going to get you thinking. Some of what this guy said made sense. And you will be able to access the slides and the text and the video afterwards and go through it again and do a bit of thinking and see what you think about what you're being told. This is another advert for a drug that's making the same point Lilly made. It's for Risperdal, but you aren't even told the name of the drug. Doctors are being told, you're hard scientists these days. The way we do things in the 21st century is we use randomized controlled trials. And if you're not using randomized controlled trials, well, you know, you're part of the 20th century and the art of medicine, which was a good bedside manner, and maybe a detailed interview, which the human sciences will tell you is context-rich. But randomized controlled trials are confounder-free, and that's a much better way to go. Forget the good bedside manner. You want a treatment that works, and you want to know what this treatment does. Now, what I'm going to say to you is that that approach, the randomized controlled trial approach, even when done by angels, is dangerous and risks alienating me from you if I'm treating you, and generally atomizing all of us. When the books are also cooked, things get worse. This takes us to what is science. And key to what is science is, where did it begin and what did the guys who began it think it was, as opposed to what people who claim to be scientists now say. And the usual story about the origins of science go back to 1660 to the foundation of the Royal Society, who set a new set of ground rules. We're not going to talk about the meaning of life here. We're not talking about theology or philosophy. We're talking about things that can be settled by data. Whether you're Christian or Hindu or Muslim or atheist or Jew, you leave all that at the door outside. You're asked to come into the room, a group of people with different points of view, you're asked to come into the room and look at the experiment happening in the apparatus in front of you. You're asked to come to a consensus view about what the best way to explain what you're seeing is. We don't think if you do this that you're going to be absolutely right for all time or even objective. It's just the best possible explanation. And we want you to try and overturn it with new apparatuses and things like that afterwards. The usual way this story is told is the Royal Society said, we were just going to concern ourselves with things that can be settled with data. The history these days focuses on the word data. I'm focusing on the word settled. Data does nothing on its own. It's your judgment about what you're seeing in front of you that creates science. There was an event that happened 40 years earlier that is usually left out of this history, which is Walter Raleigh was accused of treason in England and had his head chopped off. After he was executed, the system, the legal system said, we've made a mistake here. This was an injustice. He was convicted on the basis of things that people said he had said and said he had done outside the courtroom, people who were not prepared to come into court and be examined and cross-examined in front of a jury. That cannot be let happen again. Juries, a mixture of Christians and atheists and Hindus and Muslims and Jews, people with very different points of view come in. They can only come to a verdict based on what they see happening in front of them. Nothing else is evidence. Now, let's say Jennifer, who's here in the white coat in the middle of the front row, let's say we could go back 30 years, so she looks just as beautiful as she is now, and I look just the way I am now, or whatever. And she comes into me, and I know her and trust her, and she trusts me. And she says, look, I've been feeling a bit odd lately and strange. And what about that new drug people have been raving about, Prozac? And I say, well, maybe you shouldn't try it. It's a bit new. But in the end, we kind of opt to try it. And a week later, she comes back to me, and she says, you know, this is weird. I've never felt this way before. I'm feeling suicidal on it. And I'm not inclined to think the drug has caused it because, you know, I'm hoping to help her, and I can't. And, you know, I'm not going to think too quickly that I've harmed her. But if we talk it through, and I know her medical history, I know how she behaves normally and what weight to put on the things she's saying. I have all her lab results and her brain scans, and we can do a case conference. You know, we can bring her in here and sit her in front of all my colleagues, you. And you can ask whatever questions you like to try and work out what could explain this event. In this case, by this time, she'll have come off the drug and the problem will likely have cleared up. We might have even tried to re-expose her to it to see what happens if she's brave enough. And let's say we all conclude that the likeliest explanation of this is that Prozac has made Jennifer suicidal. You reserve the right, if new facts come to light, to change your mind, which is part of science. This is what happens. If new facts come to light, we change our view. But in the meantime, the best possible explanation is the drug has caused the problem. So Jennifer and I decide to report it to FDA in the States and Health Canada here. They get a report from us going through all the details, and the first thing they do is to remove Jennifer's name and mine. And they transform the report into hearsay. FDA and Health Canada are probably among the greatest creators of misinformation in that sense on the planet. Let's say one of you later, 30 years later, after Prozac isn't new, 30 years later now, one of you comes along and asks me, can I give you Prozac? And I give Prozac. I mean, when I say beware doctors bearing gifts, And when I say, as I'll later say, that the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of poison, you might think I'm anti-drug. I'm not. I use drugs, but part of believing in drugs and using them is knowing when not to use them. So in this case, let's say you, after we've reported Jennifer's case, many years later, 30 years later, you come to me and you want Prozac and, well, let's say you've got to some doctor and you've got Prozac and you've become suicidal and you want to take an action against the doctor or the pharmaceutical company or whatever. And you look at the FDA website where you will now find tens of thousands of reports of people becoming suicidal on SSRIs. And you say to the court, look, there's tens of thousands of reports on this. You'll be told by the lawyers for the doctor or the pharmaceutical company, this is hearsay. This isn't evidence. You can't bring it into court. But if Jennifer and I had written a report on her case 30 years ago and got it published, reviewed and published in a medical journal, that would be evidence. You would be able to take Jennifer and me into court to be cross-examined in front of a jury who could use whatever they thought about our case, her credibility and mine, and the details of the actual story. You could use these to put them in the balance to work out whether the person who has now become suicidal has a good case. This can happen. So let me take you to Matt Miller, who was a 13-year-old boy when he changed school. He'd going to a new school. He was a bit anxious when he went to his new school. And his parents took him along to a doctor who gave him Zoloft. And during the next few days, Matt became agitated, and his parents didn't know it, but he was likely becoming suicidal because he hung himself after a week in the bathroom between his parents' bedroom and his bedroom. My view was that it was evident that Zoloft was the trigger to this. It had caused him to commit suicide. Pfizer, who make Zoloft, sent investigators along to the house to comb the carpet in the bathroom to check for semen. They wanted to make the argument that this was autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong in a 13-year-old boy, before 13-year-old boys had access to the internet. The judge clearly thought Pfizer's account was crazy. She put more store on my account, but she said, look, I've been advised by outside and independent experts that if there's not controlled trial evidence that Zoloft causes people to become suicidal and commit suicide, that I can't let your report come into court. Now, I've got an image here of two limbs. I want to remind you that you've got four. Let's say you break your right ankle and go along to an emergency department who say, we're running an RCT of plaster casts. We're going to randomly apply a plaster cast to one of your limbs. In this case, you've broken your right ankle, they may apply it to the left wrist. A random application of plaster casts will beat placebo in an RCT. But practicing according to an RCT, which said randomly apply a plaster cast, would not be an intelligent way to practice medicine. It should be evident which limb you want to attach the cast to. If you're not practicing that way, you're not being intelligent. But the judge, who was a judge and had no background in medicine, said the experts are saying to me that randomized controlled trials are the way forward. In this case, Pfizer had also cooked the books, and if you had access to the controlled trial data, which I told the judge, you see that there's a tripling of the rate of people becoming suicidal on their drug compared to placebo. But the judge said, you didn't put that in your original report, so we're not going to admit it. 3 years later, the FDA and Health Canada put black box warnings for children and others becoming suicidal on these drugs, 3 years after Matt Miller was denied justice. Now, I want to change gears here slightly I'm going to take you to a company-controlled trial which created the crisis that produced black box warnings. This is a great trial. This trial has an authorship line to die for. It's got some of the biggest names in the field. It's got a Canadian Liberal Party senator on its authorship line. Look at line 2 in the middle, Stanley Kutcher, who was the Dean of Medicine in Halifax, is now a Liberal Party senator. So these are great people. These are good people. It was in university hospitals. This is not a bad trial happening in some obscure part of the world. This is the kind of trial companies aspire to. This, when they say to you, we don't do what we used to do in the past, this is the way we want trials done. Well, this essentially was that kind of trial. It was published in the journal with the highest impact factor in child psychiatry. It said that this trial shows paroxetine, Paxil, works for children who are depressed and is safe. The trial, as you see from the line at the bottom, concluded in 1998. That's 3 years before this article gets published. In 1998, when the results came in, this internal document from GSK, you're just seeing one page from 6 pages here, concluded that Paxil didn't work and wasn't safe, and the company could not publish the data. They were going to instead, as the bullet point shows you, pick out the good bits of the data and publish them. And that's what you're seeing in the Keller paper that I've just shown you. Now, this document found its way to New York Attorney General's office, who said, well, this isn't just evidence that Paxil doesn't work, this is evidence of fraud. And they took a fraud charge against GSK, which produced a crisis which helped lead to the black box warnings we have in these drugs. This also formed a part of a Department of Justice action against GSK, which a few years later led to a $3 billion fine. At the time, the biggest resolution of a case like this in corporate history. It has since been exceeded. Those 2 actions led me and a few of my colleagues to be able to access the raw data from study 329. We've had data from this trial that FDA have never seen probably in any trial that they look at, and Health Canada haven't either. And based on this data, we were able to revise the article, or as we call it, restore the article to the way we figure it should have been written in the first instance. And it got published in the British Medical Journal. The original Keller paper reported on the first 8 weeks of the trial. There was a 6-month follow-up that never got published. If you look at the first 8 weeks, we couldn't show any difference between the 3 drugs. The paroxetine, imipramine was being compared to our placebo. If you look at the 6-month follow-up, we couldn't show any difference either. There was no evidence here that this drug worked. The interest in the trial lay in the adverse events. In the Keller paper from 2001, they reported on 6 children becoming emotionally labile. There were 287 children in this trial. 6 children became emotionally labile. When you looked at the paper more closely, it looked like 4 were on Paxil and 2 on placebo. It wasn't clear what this meant. The small print, again, suggested this might have been some children who became suicidal, but it really wasn't clear. And emotionally labile doesn't sound all that bad. So most people reading the paper wouldn't really have had cause to worry. When we looked at this with access to the data, there were 18 children taking Paxil who qualified for being emotionally labile, which meant suicidal, homicidal, manic, or other serious behavioral disturbances. 18 from 93, 1 in 5 children taking Paxil. This led me to the view that RCTs are the gold standard way to hide harms. And the paper we wrote really is all about how harms get hidden. We laid out 10 different ways. I'm just going to talk to you about 3. On the right-hand side, you see the last 3 sentences in this paper, which there's probably very few other papers in any branch of medicine that say anything like this at the end of them as key points that you're supposed to remember. In essence, what it's saying is randomized controlled trials, evidence-based medicine is not like Moses bringing tablets down from the mountain where you have to obey. Your job now is to just pay heed to the 10 rules that he's laid down. Randomized controlled trials ask more questions rather than give answers. Let me take you to coding first. You've heard about emotional lability. In a Pfizer trial of a related drug, a man became agitated on the drug, poured gasoline on himself, set fire to it, and died from his burns 5 days later. Because he died from burns in hospital, the company had to write a report about what happened. And if FDA or Health Canada looked at the report, they might have been able to work out that the way Pfizer coded him as burns was probably not accurate. It would be more accurate to say he was suicidal. Since then, in the Paxil trial that we've been talking about, study 329, there were 4 children taking Paxil who vanished. One of them was a 15-year-old who had gone on Paxil and 2 weeks later was out in the street waving a gun around, threatening to kill people. He was homicidal. He was picked up by the police. He was brought to hospital. And when people are brought to hospital, there should be a report like the one you've just heard about, a 2-page report, which could let the regulator work out what might have gone on. There was no report. What the company had found was a loophole. This is 30 years ago, where they could make events like this vanish. That loophole remains there today. It doesn't take much, if I can find it, it doesn't take much wit for FDA and Health Canada to find it, but they haven't closed the loophole 30 years later. Non-transcription, we had access to the database, and roughly 1 in 6 of the side effects that kids had didn't get transferred over from the database to the report the company wrote, and the Keller paper showed even less than the report the company wrote. Keller reported on 250 events in the 93 children taking Paxil. We found 500. Now, whether 250 is right or 500 is right, if you've got that number of events, you have to group them. You put the cardiac events in a cardiac group, or respiratory events in a respiratory group. And in terms of children becoming suicidal, well, this is a behavioral event. You could do what GSK did and put them in a neurological group. Or you could totally legitimately say, well, these should be in a behavioral group. There are behavioral groups to put these things in. If you put them in the neurological group, you mix them with headaches and dizziness, which are terribly common, and the signal from the behavioral events tends to vanish. If you take the behavioral events out and put them in a behavioral group, well, the 3 drugs look completely different. Paxil looks a lot worse. When an article goes to the BMJ or any journal, the average thing is usually they get 2 reviewers. It's reviewed once. And in the case of the BMJ, they say they take 8 weeks to publish. Our article, a year later, had still not been published. We'd had 7 reviewers the first time around, and in each of the 7 reviews, we had the 7 reviewers again. The problem wasn't the reviewers or anything they said. They thought the article was okay. It was with the research editor in the BMJ, a woman called Elizabeth Loader. And she was sticking on the point that we should not transfer the behavioral events out of the neurological group where they were with headaches into a behavioral group. There was no obvious reason why we shouldn't. I mean, there's no legitimate reason why we shouldn't. We Googled her when the issue became a protracted point and found that she was an expert on headaches. She had run trials for GSK on their headache medications. That's not a sin. I've run trials for GSK. Elizabeth's interesting point was she had a husband who was a lawyer. who works for Ropes & Gray, who are the company who defended GSK. You can read all about this and see the document that you've just seen and a lot of others, including one you're going to see shortly, if you go on to study329.org. And it'll give you all of the reviews we had with the BMJ and things like that. Or you can get the story from this book, Children of the Cure, which also has the complete story. Now, in 2002, a year after the Keller paper comes out, Newsweek has this front cover which said there's 3 million teenagers who are depressed in the United States. They are going to go on to a life of crime, drug abuse, divorce, career failure, marital breakdown, suicide, you name it. But hope is on the way. FDA have approved Prozac for teenagers, and Newsweek knew something that no one else knew, which was FDA were about to approve Paxil and Zoloft for teenagers. Now, some of you who know anything about this field will know Paxil's not approved for teenagers who are depressed, nor is Zoloft. Well, here's a letter from FDA, which you can get on the Study 329 website, the full letter, not just the bit I have here, where FDA are approving Paxil for teenagers who are depressed. And they're responding to GSK saying, you have told us that Study 329 was negative, and the other 2 trials you've done in kids are negative. And we agree with you, they're negative, but we're still going to approve this drug. And you have said to us you wouldn't like us to mention this in the labeling of the drug, and we agree with you we shouldn't tell doctors or the public in the label of the drug that all the trials done on this drug were negative. Why would FDA do this? Well, in the case of the adult trials of all the antidepressants we use, and some of you may know people who are on them, the literature looks great. They're all positive trials. The drugs work well and are safe. If you looked at this, you'd say, yep, treating people who are depressed with pills is a good idea. You can't go wrong. The person who wrote this article was Eric Turner, who had worked for FDA, and he had seen the FDA reviews of these same trials and realized there was a large number of trials that were negative that were never published. But more to the point, 1/3 of the previously published positive trials had been viewed by FDA who had decided they were negative. Now, why would FDA say nothing about all these articles which claim the drugs worked wonderfully well? Well, it must have been clear to companies and FDA that if FDA said in the labeling of the drug that these trials didn't show the drug worked, the company would be exposed to a fraud action and potentially $1 billion fine. So FDA's view is that it's not their job to police the medical literature, so they say nothing, which raises the question of what is FDA's job. But before I answer that, let me show you this slide here. This is from a document showing medical writing companies writing articles for Pfizer. And this is the PTSD page. Pfizer have done 4 trials on PTSD, all negative. FDA still approved the drug on the basis that in 2 of the trials there was a marginally positive result for women, not for men. All 4 are negative for men. So FDA have approved the drug. The company wants to make sure you all use this drug that's been approved, and they have written up those 2 trials. You see under status there, if you're able to read the small print, but you will be able to get the slides and look at it closely, and even the background document if you want. The articles on these 2 trials have been written. One is going to go to the New England Journal of Medicine. The other is going to go to JAMA, the best journals there are, right? On the left-hand side, it says author TBD, to be determined. Pfizer's marketing department will pick out the names who would look best on the authorship line. The Keller paper you saw had 22 authors on it, but not the person who is the author of the paper. She's not there. These articles, and it's across the board in medicine. Any drugs you're on, respiratory drugs, gut drugs, cardiac drugs, whatever, are ghost written. They're not written by the people whose names are on the authorship line. So where is FDA in all of this? Well, I'm Irish. So it's great fun to watch the English have nervous breakdowns from time to time. You'll know they had one recently when they left the European Union. Well, 50 years beforehand, they joined the European Union and immediately ran into problems. The European regulator told them, you cannot call your favorite Cadbury's chocolate, chocolate. It hasn't got the right amount of cocoa solids in it. This caused consternation in the UK. The band talking about Brussels red tape, and they never got over it. This is what led to them leaving, okay? What's going on here? Well, the name FDA tells you what's going on. It's a food and drugs agency, and you'll be able to spot what's going on with foods. The regulator says chocolate has to have a certain amount of cocoa solids. Butter has to have a certain amount of animal fats. And in the case of drugs, it's a bit the same. You've got to lower a Hamilton Depression Rating Scale score by a small amount. Once you meet these standards, we will let you use the word chocolate or butter or antidepressant. We're not saying this is a good chocolate. We're not saying butter is good for you. And we're not policing the medical literature. That is not our job. That's a job for doctors. So this is the front cover of the BMJ some years later, where the NHS is falling apart, and the BMJ have the then Minister for Health on the front cover, and he's saying at the same time that, yeah, it's falling apart, and the worst bit is children's mental health. It's a total disaster. Now, this isn't a surprise if you think that as of 2004, 2006, when the crisis blew up, the entire literature on antidepressant trials in children was negative. The gap between, well, sorry, I got that wrong. The entire set of trials was negative. The literature was glowingly positive. These drugs work wonderfully well and are completely safe. As far as I know, no one has ever contradicted me. This is the greatest divide in all of science, not just medical science, between the published scientific claims and what the data shows when we get access to the data. And if that's the case, if your doctor is going by guidelines which depend on the published literature and expecting you to get well, well, the trial data says just the opposite is going to happen, it's no wonder that children's mental health is a disaster area. But it's not unique. What I'm describing here applies across medicine to any drugs you may be taking. This is not just an antidepressant and children's story. So you'll say to me, but FDA approved Prozac for children, which they did. And I'll say to you, they approved Paxil for children. They approved Prozac on the back of negative studies. The FDA reviews were that these trials were negative. Prozac for children has more negative trials than any other drug given to children. We've got a curious state of affairs where a lot of people know this. The left hand knows this and the right hand doesn't. Down to Charlie Brown cartoons. I don't know how old this is. I've been using it for 20 years. It probably goes back further. But Lucy, as you'll see, knows about it. Charlie Brown, I don't read Peanuts that much, but I understand he's not reacting the proper way here. When Dan's son, Dexter, went on Prozac, it can cause you, if it doesn't suit you, to have horrific thoughts about killing yourself in extraordinary, grim ways. Our homicidal thoughts are thoughts about maybe killing his father and brother, and the only way to stop this happening was to kill himself. It can do that to you. It can also do something else which is as dangerous, which is we all have thoughts about killing ourselves from time to time, but we don't do it. The anxiety or whatever gets in the way. And that's what's happening here. Charlie Brown's not acting the way he should be acting, and Lucy knows it. And lots of people on one hand know it, and on the other hand seem not to know it. So this is not just about harms. This is about a changing culture. You've got Homer saying to Bart things that Homer could not say to Bart today. The cartoon today would have a third box, and if anyone is any good at this kind of stuff and can make me a third box, where Bart says back to Homer, "Hey, Dad, you've been a bit 20th century. I've just completed a rating scale, and it shows I've got a high score, and I should go to my doctor because there are pills that will treat this." The commonest rating scale used in the depression field is the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. And here's Max Hamilton, 15 years after he makes the scale, saying this is going to standardize clinical practice. And that's a good and a bad thing. These things have got pluses and minuses. Well, what could be wrong with using a rating scale? Well, here's what could be wrong. If you come into me and I'm using the Hamilton Rating Scale for depression, you've come to me with a problem. You want me to solve that problem to help you live the life that you want to live. If instead of asking you about recipes and football results and going on to your family, the managers of the system want me to be scientific and use a rating scale, I'll be using the Hamilton Rating Scale, where there's a lot of questions where the condition you have and the pill I give you could all be causing the same thing, like becoming suicidal. In this case, if I ask you, have you been suicidal in the last week? And you say, yeah, I tried to kill myself, I'd score a 4. The scale doesn't invite me or even let me consider whether the treatment rather than the condition has caused the problem. If the treatment has caused it, I should score 0. If your score is high, your depression is getting worse, and the answer is to increase the dose of the pills, which if the pill is causing the problem, is going to make things worse and likely lead to your death. But Pfizer and Lilly and all the companies know that if I use a rating scale, I'm going to help you live the life that Pfizer and Lilly want you to live. The best place where you can see this is in this New York Times article, where the classic story behind it is teenager gets put on an SSRI. She becomes suicidal. She's told this proves that you're bipolar and we need to put you on a mood stabilizer. Now, among the mood stabilizers, half of them are antipsychotics. And what we want an antipsychotic to do is cause you to lose a little bit of focus, to stop focusing on the voices. So we give her this drug, and 2 weeks later she comes back and you ask her how she is, and she says, well, you know, maybe a bit better, but I can't focus quite as well. So the doctor gives her an ADHD rating scale, and she now ticks all of the boxes, and he says to her, my God, you've got ADHD. We need to start you on a stimulant. But stimulants pull exactly the opposite way to antipsychotics. This is crazy. This is like putting her on a weighing scales and putting 2 25-kilogram dumbbells in each of her hands, and then looking at the weighing scales and saying, my God, you're 50 kilograms overweight. I need to give you a drug to treat that. It's as crazy as that. The industry know this. It's not just an antidepressant story with rating scales. It's measurements of any sort, whether your asthma measurements or your cholesterol levels or blood glucose or bone densities. Give doctors free bone density scanners. Give them all the equipment to measure, to produce numbers. They will be producing numbers that our drugs are the answer to. One of the best examples from the start of the number era was in the 1860s in France, when we had the first weighing scales for people. And a little over 10 years later, we have the first reports of a new illness, anorexia nervosa. In the 1920s, weighing scales migrate into drugstores and come with a plate on the front of them, giving our ideal weight for our height and sex. And eating disorders mushroom. In the 1960s, weighing scales come into our bathrooms, and eating disorders explode in countries that have weighing scales, not anywhere else in the world. Weighing scales don't cause an eating disorder in their own right, but they cause the nervosa bit of it. And they cause a neurotic disorder in you, or risk. You risk getting a neurotic disorder when you start measuring aspects of your physical being, and your doctor risks getting one as well. Now, this all fed into the fact that in the 1980s, what had been healthcare became health services. Previously, it was about treating you for the problems that you brought me. I was treating you for the risks of the condition you had, trying to minimize those so you could get on to live your life. Now it became a case of you were coming to a service industry that had managers for whom the idea of bringing good out of a useful poison doesn't compute any more than it does for insurance companies. Their job is, well, managing me involves getting me, when you come along to see me, to treat you in a way which minimizes risks to the organization I work for rather than to you. And you've almost certainly felt this to some extent if you're old enough to be aware of what things were once like. Before 1980, my clinical judgment and yours was the jewel at the heart of care. It's now a problem for a service industry. Managers will tell you, managers can manage what they measure, what you see on the left-hand side. What they're producing is a lot of measurements, a lot of numbers, which put a sheen of scientific gold on things that happen in hospitals and clinics, but make care unsustainable. We can't live in this kind of situation. Care is being killed, and there are consequences to that. What this cartoon shows you is the heart of the problem. Some doctors seeing the heart of the problem, which is if they exercise clinical judgment, it's a big problem. But it's not just doctors' judgment, it's yours too. You're at stake. I had a younger brother. My mother said when he was born, something's wrong. The hospital and doctors did a bunch of tests and said, these tests are all normal, and told my father, here, give her this pill. She's neurotic. She was right and they were wrong. He died at the age of 4 months. When I went into medicine, one of the really interesting things was the fact that in pediatrics, training in pediatrics, I was told, look, if all the tests are normal and the mother is still saying there's a problem, believe the mother. This was pre-1980. My hunch was things were going to go that way across all of medicine, and that would be a good thing. That is not the way they've gone. Mothers are not believed now, even in respect of their children, or in respect of pregnancies where they're being told to take more and more drugs the whole time. And it's a white, middle-class, university-educated woman, or women, who are leading the way in this. I want to tell you about one more woman here, who was a lady who went on an SSRI, began to drink more, crashed her car, lost her job, ended up with a criminal charge, said to her doctor, I think my SSRI is causing me to be alcoholic. And he said, no, that's crazy. That's alcoholic thinking. She went along to AA, who said the same thing. This just proves if you think this way, this just proves you're an alcoholic. She had dropped out of school early, had no background in healthcare. I have a PhD in the serotonin system. I was working on these drugs before they came on the market. She came to me and told me more about the serotonin system than I knew then. She told me what drug would help her, and she was right. And the group of people who believed her, the only group of people who believed it, were the pharmaceutical companies who were working on exactly the same kind of drug to treat alcoholism. Now, what I learned from that is that motivation is worth more than expertise. Your motivation. What I learned from it is, rather than have a bunch of people that I got awfully depressed by because they're not keeping to the guidelines, and you can see, well, they're not doing well keeping to the guidelines, and you can see why, that rather than having a group of people like that who are terribly difficult and getting more difficult, I could have 100 free research assistants, and the job would be fun if I looked at and listened to you more. It's not just antidepressant. I don't know how many of you have children, but it's asthma drugs commonly given to children can make them suicidal and irritable, and you can get hooked to them. It's drugs given for acne which can make you suicidal. In the case of isotretinoin in particular, it can not just make you suicidal, but it can wipe out your ability to make love ever again, which if you're a teenager can be a hazard. In the case of the antibiotics under isotretinoin, these can cause mental illness, which your doctor is not likely to think is caused by the antibiotic and is going to treat you with all of the wrong drugs as a result of that. If you look at finasteride, which young men, including the recent president of the United States, whom I'm sure regards himself as young, take Propecia to help grow hair. It's used by young men for hair loss. But it can cause you to become suicidal, and it can wipe out your ability to make love ever again. In the case of the antihistamines, many of these are SSRIs. All of the SSRIs are antihistamines. That's where they come from. If you take an antihistamine bought over the counter and it doesn't suit you, you stop it. If you take an antihistamine from your doctor and it doesn't suit you, he says you need to continue taking it, and we may even need to put the dose up. So FDA and Health Canada license drugs on a risk-benefit basis, or benefit-risk basis. They say it's a bit like parachutes. You jump out of a plane with a parachute and you're going to live. You jump out without a parachute. In a randomized control trial we've shown, you jump out without a parachute and you die. There is a little hazard about parachutes if you're male. They can cause things to be, I'm not sure what, quite crushed might be the right word, so that you're not able to make love quite the way you would like to be able to make love for a few weeks after you've made a parachute jump. But you'd all agree, on a benefit-risk basis, parachutes are worth it. They save your life. So that's the model FDA are taking about antidepressants. The benefit is so clear and is the commonest thing that happens, and the problems aren't that bad and are much less common. Well, in the case of the benefit, it's a tiny change in a rating scale. In SSRI trials, more people die on the SSRI than on placebo. In the case of the SSRI trials, they don't fix anything with the serotonin system. That's just not what they do. They cause a change on a rating scale. And that's uncommon, doesn't happen to all people. In the case of all people that take the SSRI in the trial, within half an hour of a first pill, your genitals are going to be numb or irritable. When you stay on the pill, you're not going to make love the way you would normally make love. You may hope once you get off the pill that everything's going to go back to normal. It may not. It may get worse, and you may never, as with finasteride and isotretinoin, you may never be able to make love again properly. How FDA can say that there's a favorable benefit-risk ratio, I don't know. But the question is it FDA's job to do that? I had a man who had OCD recently. SSRIs are one of the treatment for it. We gave him SSRIs that didn't work. We gave him heavier duty drugs. They didn't help. A few weeks later, he comes back and he's clearly well. He tells me he's halted all the drugs, but this isn't what's made him well. He's gone back smoking. And he hasn't just done that. He's Googled nicotine, and there are trials showing nicotine is just as good for OCD as SSRIs. This doesn't mean stop your SSRIs and take nicotine. It means some people are probably helped by nicotine, others by SSRIs. But my point about this is two things. Well, there's 2 points. One is, if I said to you, in this case with nicotine, that the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of poison, you'd agree. And it's the same with alcohol. But if I say that about SSRIs, my medical colleagues won't agree, even though they're available on prescription only, because we've every reason to think they're more hazardous than nicotine or alcohol. We don't know what the hazards are going to be, but we think they could be pretty significant. The other point is, this man was clearly in a good place to make a benefit-risk judgment. And I think my point is, I hope you agree, that nobody is in a better place to make a benefit-risk judgment than you if you go on the pills, knowing what the risks are, and if there's a clear benefit when you take it that you and I can see, I can't see how a regulator, a bureaucrat who knows nothing about medicine, can be ever in a place to tell you what you should be doing on a benefit-risk basis. When she flies a plane, if things go wrong, she reports it, and the system changes, fixes the problem, because they know she won't fly again, and her colleagues won't until they do. Because you're going to be dead, but she is too. On the right, you've got Jane Fraser, who's the boss of Citibank in New York, who she ended up going up through the ranks in the middle of the financial crisis. When we talk about the financial crisis, we figure that one of the problems here was bankers could outsource risks, dodgy mortgages to you and me. When the mortgage blew up, we were the ones who had the problem. The bankers continued to get a high rate of pay. There was no problem to them. This is a state of moral hazard where it becomes very difficult for a banker to do the right thing. The person on the left is a doctor who, when things go wrong for you, may report it, but as you've seen, FDA and Health Canada and everybody else just files it away and nothing happens. Nothing changes. She is also outsourcing risk. She puts the pill in your mouth. When things go wrong, it's you who ends up having problems. She doesn't have a problem. We can blame the illness, not the drug. She ends up being paid just as much as she was ever paid before. This is a situation of moral hazard where it's extraordinarily difficult for a person to do the right thing, particularly if it involves being brave. We are facing a pharmaceuticalization crisis to rival the financialization crisis. This is the New York Times showing you life expectancy in the United States. And if you look at the peak, it's around 1980 when the pharmaceutical industry stopped making drugs to treat the problems you had and you needed to treat, the heart attacks, the strokes, the psychoses, and began giving pills to healthy people who had risks, who had no diseases. You didn't need treatment, you didn't need help, things like hypertension. It's also the time when service industries took over from healthcare. And it's before COVID. These data come from before COVID. Life expectancy's plummeting, and my view is it's caused by polypharmacy, not by anything else. Now, the phrase at the top comes from Paracelsus 500 years ago, and is the origins of the phrase, the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of a poison. What I want you to note, this is the original German, and the word poison in German is gift. Beware doctors bearing gifts. We used to know this. We used to often have poison stamps on medicines, but now there are serious proposals from Canadian doctors, no less, to put a stamp of a pregnant woman on antidepressant pills, which cause birth defects and can cause behavioral problems in children. We've lost that sense completely. Drugs and guns are techniques. They're amoral. Whether we bring good or bad out of them, whether we're moral or immoral, depends on us who use them. Drugs and guns cause an arms race. In the case of arms, the country that has the most efficient arms wins, so everybody else has to compete. But arms show us that there's a limit to effectiveness, that we can make an arms, like nuclear bombs, that are so effective we can't use them. In the case of drugs, it's the same. The country that was able to keep its troops alive in battle so that they only got killed by the enemy rather than disease, won wars. So the military has played a huge part in the pharmaceutical industry, the creation of, and in healthcare technologies. But in the case of drugs in particular, there's one big difference between arms and drugs, which is the arms do get better the whole time. The drugs don't. We can bring weaker and weaker drugs on the market the whole time at much more expensive prices because our propaganda, which is also a technique, is getting better. We can persuade you that these drugs are better than the ones that were before and are safer. And the main propaganda technique we have is this idea that RCTs are the way, the truth, and the light. You need, like Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau and the Pope, to believe in evidence-based medicine rather than your own experience and evidence-based medicine. If our propaganda techniques get better and better the whole time, this can only diminish us. It can't enhance us. Now, in the United States 6 years ago, life expectancy has been falling since the early 80s, but 40% of over 45s were on 3 or more drugs. 40% of over 65s were on 5 or more drugs. We know that if you're on 3 or more drugs, you're not going to get the effectiveness you might get from each of them. Once you start going on more drugs, the effectiveness from each of them drops. We know that if we reduce the number of drugs you're on from 10 or so, or even 5, down towards 3 or less, we increase your life expectancy, we reduce the likelihood you're going to go into hospital, and we improve your quality of life. If we try to do that, if you're on 10 or 8 or 5 drugs, and we try to reduce the medication burden you're on, because this can cause problems, the situation we end up with is like this still from the Hurt Locker movie, which is that there's no guidelines and no RCTs that are ever going to tell any doctor how to do this. They're going to have to depend on their own experience if they're there. They're going to have to depend on walkie-talkie if they can communicate with other colleagues who've done the same thing. But above all, the person who's best placed to tell them which of the bombs to move first is likely to be you, because you'll have missed a drug or two here or there, you'll have felt the effects, you'll have known what's possible and what isn't. And in the case of a lot of the psychotropic drugs that could be in this mix, it can be terribly hard to get off them. Only you will know which is the one for you to go for first. So it needs a close relationship between you and me if we're going to have any chance to get out of this situation alive. Now, this talk is over long with all the extras and things like that. I stuck in earlier on today 2 slides because something extraordinary happened on the world stage yesterday. There was a major event at which the leading figure in the event said these words, which could apply to the Hurt Locker slide you just seen, which will apply to any of you if we're trying to reduce your medication burden, which is there's no numbers, there's no measurement trick, there's no RCTs that tell me what to do in this case. And what he was about to do was to supply tanks to Ukraine. This was Olaf Scholz. Now, I'm sure he thinks that way about tanks, and I'd imagine you guys would agree with him about tanks. I'm equally sure that Olaf Scholz doesn't think that way about drugs. And you might say, well, tank shells are one thing, an SSRI pill might look like a tank shell, but it's a lot smaller and can't do as much harm. Well, there's very little serotonin in your and my brain. It's in your blood, it's in your gut, it's in your skin, it's in your bones, it's in your genitals. If you're a man, these drugs will wipe out your sperm count. It's like a tank shell. The magic bullet myth that it just goes one place and fixes one thing is totally wrong. If you take an SSRI to your body, you are blitzing your entire body, and that's true of most drugs. If you come to me and I want to help you reduce your medication burden, you and I will have a problem, which is the public health system in Canada. And not just that, but Canadians generally. The public health system's view is that people, when they come to a doctor, want more drugs and more labels. If I want to help you reduce your medication burden, the only way to do it is to set up a clinic on my own, a private clinic where I let you know, and the few people who might want to reduce their medication burden can come to me. If I try and do it in the public health system, I'll be told that's not tolerable here. It used to be the privilege of wealth to get treatment in order to stay alive. It's now the privilege of wealth to get off treatment in order to stay alive. In Canada, we are now leading the world in medical assistance in dying. I have no problems with this. It's another service that people are being offered. I've got a bit of concern when it comes to young women in Belgium and Holland who get medical assistance in dying for what's called treatment-resistant depression, which didn't exist before we began putting teenagers and young women in particular on 10 psychotropic drugs at the same time. My problem, my moral problem, is the morality of a system that will give you any service you want, up to and including MAID, except the service of getting off the services that it offers you. That's where I have a problem. Now, I have one bit of hope to hold out in all this. I've got a researcher who points a way forward. This lady, this is an image of my researcher. It's also a lady who comes from one of the Arthurian legends. King Arthur is out for a ride one day, and he comes to a space in the woods where there's this black knight who challenges him to a duel and beats him, and is about to kill Arthur until the black knight says, I've had a better idea. I've got a riddle. You need to answer the riddle, and if you're able to answer the riddle, come back here in a year and tell me what the answer is, and you can live. If not, you die. And the riddle is, what do women most desire? So Arthur goes back to the court and gets the entire court working on this issue, and they don't come up with an answer. So Arthur's on his way back to the Black Knight a year later, expecting to die. And on the way past, the troop of knights see this lady who says, I have the answer to your riddle, but you have to give me one of your knights as my husband. So Sir Gawain jumps down and says, Your Honor, I will be this lady's husband. And she gives Arthur the answer, who tells the Black Knight, who's not happy, but he has to let Arthur go. So they all head back to the court, and 2 days later, Gawain and the loathly lady is being married, and you can see the people are looking on and figuring, this is not a good situation. What's going to happen when they go up to the bedroom? Well, Gawain can't bear to look at her. She takes control, and he finds she's a very attractive woman. And she gives him a riddle. Do you want me to look like this in the bedchamber with you by night and the way I was looking in the court during the day? Or do you want me to look like this in the court during the day and the way I was looking in the bedchamber with you at night? And he has no idea how to answer this. And he says, whatever you want, which turns out to be the right answer. She, like you and me and the rest of us, want to control her own life. She may have a problem she brings to me for help. She doesn't want advice on how to live her life. There's almost no one in healthcare that I know, particularly in mental health, who has any idea about how to live life. Most of the rest of you who have nothing to do with the mental health system are living your lives probably a lot better than anyone in the mental health system. But one of the things is this, which is, it's a bit like my patient with the motivation thing and the free research. When I begin to look at and listen to her, she's the experimental apparatus. She's had the pill. When I begin to look at and listen to her rather than at the computer, or when I've left the New England Journal of Medicine outside the door and I'm just focused on what she said, and she is too, and cooperatively we're coming to a consensus about what's going on here and what can be done. That's science. It also makes her look more attractive and interesting to me, and as I appreciate her more, I look more interesting to her, and we start to build an us, a community. If I practice evidence-based medicine, which is all about non-existent average people, not the person in front of me. If I stop listening to and looking at this person, then there's no chance of a community. There's no chance of an us. There's a false we. This is a moral issue, a profoundly moral issue, and it's one that links into the First Nation issue, the Blackfoot and First Peoples issue. The image in the middle there is a two-spiral wampum, which is about just that kind of cooperation. Working with each other, we can learn from each other and we can make things better. Now, in this image, you'll see some black robes over on the left, on this side, and white coats on the opposite side. And you'll all know here that 200 years ago or 100 years ago or so, and up till quite recently, people wearing black robes came along and stole the souls of the people who were here first, particularly their children, who told them the way of life was wrong and they should be living differently. We now have a situation where white coats, we're facing a white coat storm. There's a lot that all of us, not just the first people, in this sense, we're all first people now. You've got an evidence-based apparatus that wants to change our way of living, that challenges our own sense of our own lives and our own bodies, that says you've got to put that aside in favor of what's in the New England Journal of Medicine or whatever. And the place where this shows most clearly is in the case of our children, children like Dexter. We are all first people now, and we need to find a way to resist. Thank you.